So my name is David Grant. I'm the parish priest in charge at St John's in North Bar Without. A little bit about me. I am from Hull. My dad was in the old Hull City Police for 30 years, and I've been a priest now for 42 years, which seems an awful long time. I became the priest in charge of the parish priest at St John's in 2015. There are two other priests who live in the parish, although not in my house. Father Francis Sutcliffe, who lives in Wilbert Grove, and Father Francis Gallagher, who lives in Wiley's Road. So we tend to get called upon to do supplies when other priests are away. For example, Father Gallagher is in Hull today because one of the priests there who's from the Philippines has gone home, so he's looking after his place for him. We also look after the parish in Hornsea, and we have this strange anomaly of having oversight for a private church. You might think, well, what's a private church? It's a church near Burton Constable Hall that belongs to the Chichester Constable family, and it's their church. But we are invited in, and we have a kind of a spiritual oversight there. Also in the diocese, that's our area of operation, which is from the Tees to the Humber, the Diocese of Middlesbrough, as it's called. I have responsibility for ongoing formation for the clergy, the retired clergy, and those training to be deacons. So we always get a few jobs. Now, I've just been away at a conference actually in Ireland, so I sent a text to Richard last Monday and gave him the scripture readings that we'll be using in our church today, because in our setup, obviously, we're a lot more formal than you guys, but we have a 3-year lectionary, and the idea is that over the course of 3 years, we read at Mass on a Sunday, a substantial part of both the Old and the New Testaments. And so the readings appointed for today was a reading from Isaiah, because we're reading the book of Isaiah in the first reading at Mass. The second reading is from 1 Corinthians, because we're reading that epistle at Mass. And the Gospel is the story of the wedding at Cana. And I sent those to Richard basically because I was too lazy to prepare 2 sermons. So there we are. But when we come to that very familiar story of the wedding feast at Cana of Galilee, I think we need to be very prayerful and reflective in our study of that story, because St. Jerome, the great translator of the Scriptures, said, ignorance of Scripture is ignorance of Christ. Now, hopefully, our familiarity with the Scriptures doesn't breed contempt, but I think with this gospel, it can engender a sort of triviality. What does it mean? Well, I'll tell you. One of the things I don't like, and I don't think I'm being particularly antisocial or miserable, I hate wedding receptions with a vengeance. Unless I know the families very well, because in our setup you find they tend to invite, oh, we better invite father. Oh, yeah, it's another 50 quid on the bill, but, oh, well, you know. So you get invited, and of course, you've all been there. The photographs go on for ages. And then people start on the meal and the drinking, and then several times, being dressed like this, someone has come up to me and said, oh, I'm pleased you're here. If the bar run dry, you'll do that water to wine bit, won't you? And you smile sweetly, and really you'd just like to chin them, because you've heard it all before. And also, sometimes people look at this reading. I've heard someone say, well, it's about Jesus being kind to this young couple so they wouldn't be embarrassed. Yes, clearly there's an element of that. And I've also heard something very sexist against us poor downtrodden men. I know that's a shock, but I once heard a lady speaking on this and saying, well, isn't it interesting? Jesus is like us in all things but sin, but he's a typical man. So he needed his mother, stroke wife, stroke sister, to give him a nudge and say, hey, get on with it, they need some help. And I thought, well, no, not really. Know where the speaker was coming from, but again, it's a trivialization. So what are we to take from this sublime reading? The first miracle story in John's Gospel. And we know that not one word is superfluous in the Scriptures. Not one word is just mere packing to give the story a bit of bulk or whatever. Every word is carefully chosen. And so Jesus and his friends find themselves at a wedding celebration. And that's significant in itself. Because, for example, that first reading from Isaiah we use today talks about a time after an alienation between God and the people of Israel. And God then takes them back. He gives out his invitation via Isaiah to the people. And he talks about it in terms of a wedding. Your land shall be married. For us, the bridegroom rejoices over the bride. So shall your God rejoice over you. As you know, I'm sure you're very familiar, that the analogy throughout what we call the Old Testament is that the people of Israel, the Jewish people, are the bride and God is the bridegroom. There's a sense of that intimacy between God and his people that can only be approximated by the bond of man and woman in marriage. And then we have the image of water, the 6 stone water jars that are there for the ablutions that are customary among the Jews. And again, the water has a deep symbolism and significance. We think about Genesis, where the Spirit of God hovers over the water at the beginning of creation, in one of those creation stories. We think about the story of Noah, and Noah and his faithful family being preserved from the waters of the flood. We think about the parting of the Red Sea at the Exodus. There are so many allusions to water, and it's completely understandable because, of course, as you know, if you've been to the Holy Land, as I'm going to stand away from that thing before I knock it over. If you've been to the Holy Land, as I've had the great joy of doing several times, in many places, it's very arid. And so water is absolutely essential. And so the Torah was seen symbolically as being like water. God irrigating, nourishing, bringing to fruition through the Torah his relationship with his people. So we've got that image of water. And then again, in the Old and the New Testament, you have the image of the temple in Jerusalem and the streams flowing from it. In the Old Testament, in the New Testament, it's the New Jerusalem. And again, the image of the potency of water. So we've got all this water here at the wedding feast at Cana. And Jesus turns it into wine. Now, we just started using a new translation of the scriptures, a bit more up to date in our liturgy. And so in our reading this morning, it said, Each of these stone water jars held 70 or 100 litres. It's an amazing amount of wine. Why are we told this? Is it John's getting a bit fixated with numbers about amount? No. What he's trying to say is that there's more than enough. More than enough. Such is the abundance of God. Such is his bounty. Such is his grace. And our second reading today is that famous passage in 1 Corinthians about the gifts. And I often wonder whether we truly believe that we are gifted. Well, we read those passages of Scripture and think, well, that was Corinth in the first century. They didn't have some guy from the local area speaking, so it was St. Paul. If I was sat in that house in Corinth and St. Paul was definitely got to move over here. And St. Paul was talking to me. Yes, fantastic. It would all slot into place. Bang, yes. Everything would be so easy. But it's different. We're living in Beverley in the 21st century. Different things are happening, and we look at the world, the Middle East and Ukraine. Oh, isn't it awful? Oh, terrible. If only it was like the past. And it is like the past. Because God's bounty, God's overwhelming gifts, which surpass our often mean-spiritedness, are there for every generation. Those gifts which we hear spoken of by St. Paul to the church in Corinth are there accessible for us. And also, in that gospel story, we hear of Mary. Why does John mention her? There was a wedding at Cana of Galilee. Mary, the mother of Jesus, was there, and Jesus and his disciples were also invited. And because the language is rather sparse, it can, in some translations, come across that Jesus is almost being disrespectful to his mother, because when she says in some translations, they have no wine, he says, what is that to me? And then something very significant, my hour has not yet come. My hour has not yet come. What does Mary say? She goes to the servants and she says, do whatever he tells you. My hour has not yet come. I'm sure you're familiar with the theology of John's Gospel. The hour is Christ's sacrifice on the cross. If you go toward the end of John's Gospel, this is the beginning of the end, when we're leading up to the saving events of Maundy, Thursday, Good Friday, and then Easter Day, Jesus talks about his hour to come. And there is great drama in that. Remember that very, very short sentence when Judas goes out after dipping his hand in the dish and he goes to finalize his handing over of Jesus. And he says, night had fallen. It seems that darkness, evil, has overcome. And yet, Jesus says to the timid Nicodemus, remember Nicodemus comes to him at night, and Jesus says to him, when I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw all people to myself, meaning the lifting up on the cross. And again, it seems so strange because the cross is a sign of degradation, a sign of punishment, a sign seemingly of utter failure. And yet, this is his hour. It's that hour when humankind is reconciled with the Father. And of course, the resurrection is the vindication of that. So it's interesting that John puts into the mouth of Jesus, my hour has not yet come, but it is coming. And when that hour has come, this symbolism of this superabundance of wine will then no longer be a symbol. You'll see it quite clearly. It means that God is giving us everything. Everything. And it's only our failure to perceive that we don't see the signs. We don't see what the water to wine means. Water to wine to God's abundant life forever. And it's interesting again what Mary says. What does she say to the servants? Do whatever he tells you. As we reflect on this gospel, on how it should impact in our lives, we should remember her words. Do whatever he tells you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.